It's actually a global health issue. The quality of our nighttime sleep defines the quality of our consciousness. Communication skills, one's creativity, all the things that make us such a special animal, that make us what we are blunted by not getting the sleep we need. In my experience, the only difference between a morning person and an evening person is that morning people are just horribly smug.
So if you sleep less, you become a much more negative-minded person.
Exactly. So everything we do is being modulated. It's being fine-tuned to the very demands of the light-dark cycle.
What is the message you would most like to get across to people that are watching or listening about sleep? Russell, I can't think of a better person to talk to about sleep, bad or otherwise. So let's start with, let's start with the problem. Why do we all think we have a sleep problem? Where does it come from?
Well, I think it's fascinating to look at historically. I mean, those of us who remember the 80s, and from your smile I sense you don't.
Just a smidgen. I can just about recall it.
People come into the lab, for example, I've done another all-nighter. Whoa, isn't that fantastic? And we'd all pat them on the back. And it took about 20 years to appreciate that sleep is not an indulgence and a luxury, and that's something we should simply override. But critical amounts of biology are going on whilst we sleep. So at the turn of the century, people think, maybe there's some interesting science here, maybe start to think about sleep more seriously. And now, 2024, we are rather obsessed with sleep. And I think there's some very unfortunate messaging going on about sleep. So you must get 8 hours. And I had somebody who came up to me after a public talk and said, I don't get 8 hours of sleep. Am I going to die? I said, yes, you're going to die. But it may be very independent of that 8 hours. And the key thing about sleep is that one size does not fit all, just like shoes. And it's an incredibly dynamic and flexible behavior. And so we have to define what kind of sleep that we need, because we're all so different. And then not worry about the sergeant majors screaming at us, you must do this and you must do that. And I think where we are at the moment is that we have a medical condition called sleep anxiety. People are so anxious about not falling to sleep, or if they wake up, not getting back to sleep, or not getting the so-called sleep that is dictated to them, that they don't sleep. They have sleep anxiety, which means they don't sleep properly. So I think we need to step back and regard sleep as an essential part of our biology, prioritize sleep, but with an understanding that our individual sleep patterns vary.
It's so interesting, isn't it? Because I live with a professional sports person, with an athlete. So I've always understood how important it is for him to get decent sleep. Not like you say necessarily 8 hours, but just decent quality sleep as and when he gets it. But for some reason, I've not prioritized my own sleep.
Well, we all don't.
Why?
I mean, well, because sleep, we didn't grow up thinking about the importance of sleep. It's one of my sort of beefs is the fact that we don't teach sleep and the importance of sleep in our school systems. 30% of our biology, on average, will be sleep biology. We provide no information about the importance of sleep, why we should prioritize sleep to our school kids.
So what would we tell them? What would we tell them? What's the first thing we'd tell them if they were learning?
I think understanding the biology, the fundamental biology. This is not some sort of shutting down process. It's a very active process. And while we sleep, we are consolidating memory, for example. The information that has been flooding in during the day, and particularly when you're young, is then being consolidated, stabilized while we sleep. But it's not just the retention of facts. What's so really fascinating is that we're thinking about problems and coming up with a novel solution to a complex problem, which is, after all, what we're all facing, is improved hugely by a night of sleep. We know that if we don't get the sleep we need, our stress axis is turned on, and of course there are lots of downsides to that. Increased frustration, overly impulsive, and actually sustained suppression of the immune system as a result of turning on the stress axis. So it's a global health issue. So many people think, I'm feeling tired at an inconvenient time.
Yeah.
And it's so much more than that. It's actually a global health issue. The quality of our nighttime sleep defines the quality of our consciousness. Sleep is the best cognitive enhancer we've got. And that's why we need to take it seriously. That's the sort of thing that, so educational performance, hugely enhanced by good sleep. And children and young people need to know this. And of course, by arming individuals with that information early in life means it then carries on into later life. And people think, well, okay, should I really be working into the early hours of the morning? Is this really going to enhance my ability to deliver the day job or not? It's those sorts of questions that we need to answer.
It's interesting, isn't it? Do you think the debate we're having at the minute in 2024 is quite superficial as regards to sleep? I mean, we all understand that we probably need better sleep, but it's still quite superficial, because when you dig down a little deeper, like you say, in terms of the educational piece, we all now understand that a good diet early on in life is going to furnish us with what we need moving forward, and we'll make better decisions as a result of it.
Absolutely.
We'll learn more about, how our bodies are responding to good food pieces as opposed to bad. But we don't do that with sleep.
No, and
we don't do it.
I don't understand why. We did a study a few years ago now on working with teachers to define the best way to teach good sleep habits to early teens. And we developed with the teachers 8 30-minute sessions that the teachers delivered. So it's not like academics were coming in and sort of talking. These are the kids knew the people delivering this information. And we showed that in those 20, maybe 25% of young individuals who had what would be called sort of clinical insomnia, that level of insomnia improved after education alone, after those 8 sessions. So we've demonstrated that it can have an impact. And this is why I'm bemused that it hasn't become part of the national curriculum. Incidentally, I would say that there's something we discovered in our naivety, is that we asked the young adults, do you share your bedroom with anybody? Do you share your sleeping space? Expecting yes, of course. And these were individuals from a low socioeconomic group. What we didn't ask is, do you have a bed? And what emerged from those discussions with these young teens was many of them didn't.
Wow.
They were trying to sleep on the family sofa.
And many in the same room or the same...
Multiple occupancy bedrooms. But the worst thing was that kids were trying to sleep on the family sofa while the rest of the family were watching television. So they were then entering school the next day absolutely shattered. Unable to make full use of their educational opportunities. And so what you've got there is already they're being marginalized. And I think this was a real eye-opener for me, that poor sleep is not just, in the white-collar and the blue-collar workforce, it's actually in our young people. I was really, really distressed by this, actually.
What does a bad night's sleep do? Do to the mind and body?
Okay. So, first of all, how do you know if you're getting a good night of sleep?
That's a good point.
And the first is, it's kind of the wisdom from our grandparents, which is, are you able to function optimally during the day? We know if we're firing all cylinders or not. Do you need somebody or an alarm clock to get you out of bed because you are fast asleep when you need to wake up? Does it take you a long time to wake up? Are you feeling sort of cloudy, and do you have what's called sleep inertia? Do you crave caffeinated drinks, to drive the waking day? Do you require a nap, or do you crave a nap? Do you find you're doing sort of do you find greater frustration? Do you find you're doing stupid, unreflective things? And are your friends and family saying, hang on, you don't have quite the same sense of humour, you're being more aggressive, you're not the person
you're grumpy.
You were, you're grumpy. And final criteria is, do you oversleep extensively on free days when you don't have to get up? Or particularly when you go on holiday, when your sleep pattern is being unmasked.
Well, we talk about catching up on sleep, don't we?
Exactly. Yeah. And so if you're sort of ticking the boxes for that, you're not getting the sleep you need. And then you need to think, well, what can I do? And we can unpack that later. But the consequences of not getting sleep, one's emotional changes. One thing I found absolutely fascinating is that one's ability to interact with others, your empathy, for example, is blunted. You can't pick up the social signals from others, so you don't quite know, what's going on. The other thing that I think is so important is that the tired brain remembers sort of negative experiences, but forgets the positive ones.
That's really fascinating.
And so one's whole worldview is biased towards the negative, and therefore your decision.
So if you sleep less, you become a much more negative-minded person.
Exactly. Yes. So that's some of the emotional things that can change. And I would say you can fall into, we sort of touched on this, a stimulant sedative feedback loop, whereby you're driving the waking day with caffeine. And then and caffeine can last in the body, depending on who you are, for quite some time. Certainly 5 to 9 hours is the range. That's the half-life, so it hasn't gone away by 9 hours. And so then it gets to fairly late in the evening, you think, God, I've got to get some sleep. So then people will use alcohol or sleeping tablets to sedate themselves. And I use the word sedation purposefully, because that's what you're doing. Some of the important things going on within the brain whilst we sleep, memory consolidation, the processing of information, is actually impaired. So
all of that's warped by that process. It's
blunted by alcohol and even, the new generation of Z drugs. Moving on to sort of cognitive responses, well, again, memory consolidation, the processing of information, it simply goes, one's communication skills, one's creativity, all the things that make us such a special animal, that make us what we are blunted by not getting the sleep we need. And that's over a relatively short period of time. So then we move on to...
So how quickly a short period of time are you talking about?
You're talking within 24 hours, 48 hours, you're seeing significant differences, depending upon how much sleep you're losing. But really, quite an important impact over short periods of time. And then over years, of course, if you're a night shift worker, for example, you are forcing your body to be awake when your biology is saying, you should be asleep.
Yeah.
And the way we get over that, and we may be the only species that can override this sort of biological drive for sleep, is by activating the stress axis. And of course, what you're doing is you're increasing heart rate, you're throwing glucose into the circulation, which is why sustained stress is associated with cardiovascular disease and metabolic abnormalities such as diabetes too. Now, stress gets a bad rap. It's a wonderfully adaptive response.
Just explain that a little, because I think that's so important. There is such a thing as good stress.
Oh, it is.
There's bad stress and good stress.
So I liken it to the first gear in an engine.
Yeah.
If you want to get away, you shove the engine into first gear and off you go. But if you leave the engine in first gear, then you're going to bugger the engine. Yeah. And that's the problem. So what you need to do is not keep the engine in first gear. You can't run on constant stress. And so there are so many issues. It's interesting that sadly, what we've done is define the importance of sleep by not getting enough of it. We are now beginning to understand some of the really other underlying biology. So this sort of clearance system has been discovered recently called the glymphatic system. And it sort of gets rid of toxins. And there's a misfolded protein called beta amyloid, which can build up naturally, but whilst we sleep is packaged up and got rid of. And some studies first in mouse models and then humans have shown that if we don't get sleep, then beta amyloid can build up within the brain and the cerebral spinal fluid. Now, this is possibly the mechanism where very poor sleep in the middle years is considered to be a risk factor for dementia and Alzheimer's later on. Now, I wouldn't say that poor sleep is going to cause dementia and Alzheimer's, but if you are vulnerable, then this is a contributing factor.
That will accelerate it.
Exactly, yeah.
Wow. Yeah. And then in terms of the longer term process as well, we've talked about bad sleep, 24 hours, 48 hours, and the impact that can have. So in terms of all-round health and well-being, you just mentioned about the impact it can have in those susceptible to early onset dementia or whatever it may be moving forward. Yeah. But what about other illnesses as well? Is poor sleep and poor quality sleep responsible for a lot of what might come next?
There's a very interesting set of relationships. So if we just pick off a few, if we think about mental health, so studies that we've done, and with my colleagues in psychiatry, Dan Freeman, we've shown that there's appalling sleep in many mental health conditions. And quite a few years ago, we studied this in schizophrenia.
Yeah.
And Dan had a group of young people who had poor sleep, but were showing showing high levels of paranoia and hallucinatory experiences. So the logic was, if we could even partially stabilize sleep in those individuals, would we reduce the levels of paranoia and hallucinatory experiences? And we did. And I think this is a very good illustration that we can think of sleep.
And did that happen almost instantaneously, or was that over a period of time?
Of 10 weeks, and then with a follow-up after, I think, 16 weeks or so. And it was really remarkable. And this was cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, and delivered digitally, using a sort of a program called Sleepio, developed by one of my colleagues, Colin Espy. And I mean, what was remarkable is that this could deliver CBTI, cognitive behavioral therapy, to large numbers of individuals. And so it just illustrated the point that for mental health, sleep can be considered as a therapeutic target, I think, for many. So that's one area where it's incredibly important. We know that in cancer treatment, that stable sleep-wake cycles can improve your trajectory, your long-term health gains, or can improve your chances of making the best of the chemotherapy or the radiotherapy that you get. So there are many examples where health is hugely impacted and enhanced by good sleep.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it?
I mean, one area which I think is important, because, I mean, there's several things we should unpack, which is, of course, we live in a 24/7 society. So
we're our own worst enemies on that one, aren't we?
We are.
That is a problem.
But we're not going to put that particular genie back in its bottle.
No.
So what we can do is think about ways of mitigating some of the problems. And I think in the same way we've talked about getting information into our schools, we need to get this information into the work sector. So employers need to know that their night shift workers will have higher rates of diabetes 2, coronary heart disease, potentially even cancer. So why aren't we introducing high frequency health checks to those vulnerable groups? And also obesity, type 2 diabetes, common. What do we provide in the canteens? You know, it's the worst possible combination. High fat, high sugar. We're not, and it's completely bizarre to me that with such a strong food industry in the UK, we haven't developed something for our night shift workers that will be tasty, nutritious, easy to digest, but not promote some of the things that you see, you know, the poor health that you see in our night shift workers.
I feel like also that brings up the conversation about circadian rhythms, because we talk about night shift workers. Just explain exactly why they are hugely vulnerable in this area.
Yeah, I remember a few years ago, I was at a meeting where the chairman of the Confederation of British Industry stood up and said, we're going to cure the problems of British industry. We're going to run it on a 24/7 basis. We won't have lots more building of expensive offices in London. We can get rid of the commute and all the rest of it. So here's a bright man with good intentions, but absolutely no idea of the biology. And for our biology to work, if we step back, it's delivering the right sort of materials at the right concentration to the right tissues and organs at the right time of day. And it's the circadian system that provides this time structure for life. And so everything we do is being modulated. It's being fine-tuned to the very demands of the light-dark cycle, the 24-hour rotation. Classic mismatch between the internal day, the biological clock, the circadian rhythms, and the external day is jet lag. And we get rid of jet lag primarily, well, no, not exclusively, as a result of exposure to light in the new time zone. Light is the key feature whereby the internal day and the external day become aligned. And that's the problem for the night shift worker. So what happens is they're working under relatively dim light in the factory or the workplace. Then they're experiencing bright natural light during the day. And quite rightly, the body clock always defers to the brighter light signal as being daytime, which it is. And so for 97% of night shift workers, they do not adapt to the demands of working at night. Now, there's one group that does, and this is some wonderful studies by Josephine Arendt, who sadly died last year. A wonderful researcher, very fond of Jo. And she showed in the North Sea oil rigs that they did adapt.
How?
Well, they were out on the platforms on the rigs under great big bright arc lights, and then they slept during the day in windowless metal boxes. And so they flipped. Just as you adapt to jet lag, these people shifted. Problem is, when they went home on shore leave, they were 12 hours maladapted, and they complained bitterly because that's when they wanted to have fun, interact with their friends and family. And of course, when the friends and family are asleep, they were awake. So it is complicated, but that's the primary reason. And some studies from Harvard have shown that if you increase the light in a factory to 2,000 lux, which isn't very bright, and I urge your listeners to download a lux meter onto their smartphone, because then you can actually get a sense of the light that we're exposed to.
So what should we be exposed to?
Well, the rule of thumb is about 10,000 lux for half an hour is a robust light signal.
Okay.
And so what the Harvard group did, they only used 2,000 lux, but it was over an extended period of time. It was across the night shift. And that was up from something like 300 or 400 lux. So it's at least 4 times more. Yeah. And then, of course, hid them from light during the day. And they adapted. But of course, that's just not a practical solution for many. And it's, again, worth bearing in mind. Most people don't want to do night shift work. But for women, for example, it's one of the few areas, if you're a nurse, where you can combine a job with children. Yeah. And so you're getting the kids off to bed, you go to the night shift, you can get back home after the night shift, get them off to school. So it's brutal. And so, yes, but it's not going to go away. Our frontline staff, we need our frontline staff, but it's all about trying to make their experience as tolerable as possible. And one idea I've had, and I don't have evidence for it, is that we know that these conditions, particularly physiological and health conditions, get worse with time. Yeah. So should we limit night shift work to 3 to 4 years, you then come off and then you can go back on. Now, the problem is you won't get paid the top rates because you're not working on night shift. So we've got to get the economic, the financial equation sorted as well.
It's interesting. I used to work night shifts years ago. And
what did you do?
I did. When I was a runner at GMTV, like almost the first job out of university, I did night shifts for a period of time then, for about 2.5 years or so. And then I ended up doing a shift for about 6 years, which was I had to be in at 3 a.m. in the morning and I'd be going home at about 11 a.m. midday, lunchtime time. And I honestly swear to God, I mean, my mother was always like, this is aging you. This is seriously aging you. But you felt the impact of that. And just sort of a month out of that, you would feel like you had rejuvenated and you'd rebuilt. So that was just my experience. But it definitely led me to believe that the nocturnal way of doing things and working those night shifts and working at times when you're at body and mind is absolutely saying the opposite. It's very hard to manage.
One additional area which I think is so important is that some sectors of night shift work, the divorce rate is 6 times higher than the same job during the day shift. And I think this is where another important educational piece where you're not only letting the workforce know what the impacts might be, but also the people they live with, and that they know that their partner could well suffer changes in behaviour. And it's not that they turned into a monster.
No.
It's just, this is an inevitable consequence of driving your biology outside of its normal range.
So let's just, in isolation, let's just explain perfectly, in your words, not mine, what a good sleep cycle should look like. And then we'll do the circadian rhythm piece. But what should a good sleep cycle look like?
Well, I think...
And I know it's different for everybody.
Yeah, it is very different for everybody. And I think that it's all about, are you getting the sleep that you need? Do you feel rested? But what we can do is we can step back and describe the biology a bit. So we have two phases of sleep, which have been called non-REM, non-rapid eye movement sleep, and rapid eye movement sleep. And non-REM can be divided into now 3 stages. So light sleep going into 2, and then 3 into deep sleep.
Yeah.
Deep non-REM sleep. And that's associated with information processing, memory consolidation. And then you bounce very rapidly up into rapid eye movement sleep, where if you look at your partner, or indeed your dog, when it's asleep, you see those eyes moving, and we are paralyzed from the neck down. We have what's called atonia. And the argument for that is that's when we experience our most vivid and complex dreams. We do dream in non-REM sleep, but the most vivid and complex are in non-REM sleep. And the argument is that we're paralyzed because we might act them out, our dreams. And there are conditions called REM behavior disorder where people don't have that paralysis. It's failed for whatever reason. And so they've murdered their partner, for example, thinking somebody has broken in. And they have no recollection of this whatsoever. They're just acting out their dreams. And actually, naturally...
What about people who sleepwalk?
That's different. Okay. Because that's during non-REM sleep.
Okay.
And of course, many children, sleepwalk. I did as a kid. I terrified my poor parents by walking out of the bedroom on one occasion. I was told this, of course. And I turned right, peed in my mother's shopping basket. And then said, says my father, "Where's mummy?" Then they guided me back to bed. So, yeah, but you grow out of that. But
Thankfully.
Thankfully, yes. No, I don't remember.
You're still doing that now,
I'm not aware that I peed in anybody's shopping basket unknowingly.
For a number of years.
Unknowingly. I may have done it deliberately. So
sleepwalking is completely different.
Yeah,
That's
it's a group of conditions called parasomnia, which is grinding teeth, sleepwalking, and all, which can be indicative of some problems, but most people grow out of it.
Yeah.
But REM sleep REM behavioral disorder is that you don't get that paralysis, so you can be acting out your dreams. Some terribly sad cases of that, and we wake naturally from REM sleep. Which is why, if we wake naturally, we're more likely to remember our dreams. So that cycle of non-REM, REM will take about 70 to 90 minutes, depending upon how old you are and a whole bunch of other things. And you'll go through 4 or 5 of those cycles every night, waking hopefully naturally from REM sleep. And of course, during those different phases, we've talked about memory consolidation, the processing of information during non-REM sleep. REM sleep seems to be important for emotional processing and for reducing anxiety. So you're working through during REM sleep some of the issues that may be concerning you.
It's interesting, that, isn't it? I wonder how many people realise that.
Well,
that is the process you go through in your sleep, that to unpack all of your issues.
Exactly.
Takes place during that time.
And what's fascinating is some very interesting data came out of New Yorkers. So after the Twin Towers were destroyed by terrorist action, dream reports were not of planes crashing into buildings, which is interesting because that was the imagery that we were all bombarded with, but it was being mugged or being overwhelmed by a tsunami. And it was the brain trying to make sense of the emotional context and the anxiety that people were experiencing. And in fact, if people are selectively deprived of REM sleep, you see higher levels of anxiety. So again, highly structured. And we're doing different things in different stages. But it's still a pretty crude understanding. So we measure these different states by using the electrical activity recorded from the surface of the skin on the scalp. And it's been a technique that's been used for 60, 70 years or so. But one of my colleagues recently said, yeah, trying to understand what the brain is doing by using electroencephalography, EEG, is a bit like trying to work out what goes on in a building by looking at when the lights go on and off and the toilets flush. Yeah. And so it's a pretty crude measure. We're getting better. There's some remarkable work emerging on what's going on within the brain while we sleep. Yeah, it is an interesting time, but it is complicated. And going back to your original question, that's the formal description of cycles of sleep.
And that doesn't have to happen in an 8-hour period. You don't need 8 hours. There's a lot, like you say, there's been a lot of myths around this. You need 8 hours to make this perfectly work.
Yeah, and I should say the deep sleep, the slow wave sleep, is stage 3 non-REM sleep. Tends to occur during the first half of the night, and we get more REM sleep during the second, which is actually under circadian regulation. And what's also interesting is that deep sleep, if you don't get sufficient deep sleep, then the next night the brain will instruct itself to get more. So it's self-regulating, which I think is also very interesting. It's protected, yeah. And so there are lots of features of that. So waking up in the middle of the night, we all do it.
Yeah.
Most of us are not conscious of it, and we fall back to sleep again. But it's
a common complaint. I mean, it's one of these things. Going to sleep stressed, being calm before you go to sleep, waking up in the middle of the night, waking up too early. Those are all the things that people regularly complain of. Right?
Absolutely. And of course, the default pattern for human sleep is either biphasic or polyphasic, meaning you go to sleep, you wake up, and then you go back to sleep again. And there's some Richard Ekirk from the United States has done some wonderful studies looking at the historical literature before the Industrial Revolutions and found that endless discussions about first sleep and second sleep and on all of this. So, and of course, Tom Weir then used that sort of historical research and took people into the lab, youngsters actually, university students, 12 hours of light, 12 hours of dark, and given the opportunity to expand the sleep duration, people showed biphasic and polyphasic sleep. So waking up in the middle of the night is not something we should be worried about.
No.
The key thing is staying calm, staying relaxed, and then you'll go back to sleep again. And lots of people use lots of different tricks. It may be going off, leaving the bed and having a few pages of Jane Austen. For me, I'm hooked on BBC Radio 4 Extra. Given in our time with Melvyn Bragg, I am away within 5 minutes.
So I'm sure he'd take as a real compliment.
And I love the programme. And I think it's just something very relaxing.
Yeah.
You know, and it's unchallenging.
So we just shouldn't be threatened or worried by it, because I suppose that leads to further anxiety, which means you won't go to sleep easily again.
That's exactly right. And also, one thing that is fascinating, many of us have an illuminated alarm clock by the side of the bed. So you might wake up and you might glance and say, oh my God, it's only 2 hours before the alarm goes off. Yeah. And then you get completely stressed. It doesn't matter. You just black out the front of it's only when you need the alarm. You don't need to know how many hours before the alarm goes off.
But you're so right about that issue whereby in years gone by, it very much used to be a power play where who could get the least sleep.
Oh, yeah.
And therefore that person, I mean, I think it came really from Maggie Thatcher's comment about only being able to survive on 4 hours a day and function, as she did on 4 hours a day.
Well, I spoke to one of her aides, quite a few years ago now, and he said, yeah, it's true. I mean, we used to deliver red boxes and they would be done by morning. But
worked for her, not for everybody.
It worked for her short time.
Yeah.
But of course, what was so tragic is that she developed dementia. Now, again, I can't say whether it was the shortened, adrenaline-fueled, life and short sleep that generated the dementia, but it certainly wouldn't have helped on the basis of the biology we now understand. And yeah, I think during, going back to the 80s, it was a badge of honor. Sleep is for wimps. And then at that time, there was no appreciation of what's really going on within the brain. So I think that the scientific community have been brilliant in that sense, because we've defined the importance of sleep.
But you must be really enjoying this moment for sleep, because it's putting it back on the map as something that is fundamentally a huge. I mean, in sport we talk about performance gains all the time.
Yes.
I mean, it has to be the single most important fundamental performance gain for anyone in any line of work or activity, because if you can get that right, everything else from it will come.
Well, absolutely.
I've not prioritised it until now.
Exactly. I've been banging on about it for ages, and I
listen to me. I've got good things to say.
Oh God, Russell, you're such a sleep bore. It was interesting. We had a senior management group recently, and we afterwards we went out for dinner, and people were drinking coffee at sort of 9 o'clock in the evening. And I just looked at them, and they said, enough, okay?
Don't judge me.
Don't judge me, yeah. I take no great pleasure in being right. Oh, yes, I do, actually. But actually, I think that the really important part is that people now are understanding. My worry is we've almost gone too far.
Interesting.
And that we just need to embrace the sleep that we get, not endlessly worry about it. And, most people don't have a sleep problem. And as you've already touched on, it's an anxiety or a stress issue. And it's all about winding down at the end of the day and finding a way to relax so that you drift off to sleep appropriately. And if you wake up, then it's fine. Just stay chilled and relaxed. You will go back to sleep. And it's that, sleep isn't a monolith. It's not something, that can't change and is inflexible. I mean, our sleep patterns change massively as we age. And we adapt to that. So when people say in their 70s, oh, I wish I had the sleep I had when I was 30. Well, you won't. But different is not necessarily bad. I mean, my mum was a great example. She said, I've never had better sleep since I've retired. It was just wonderful. I don't have to worry about stuff. I don't have to worry about the job. And she developed the sleep pattern that she developed. We were told very firmly not to ring before 11 o'clock in the morning. And, and we didn't. And it was so funny because we moved closer to Oxford, and one of our neighbours, who was living opposite, noticed that she pulled back the blinds at 11 o'clock in the morning and sort of said, oh, you're right, to sleep, what's going on? Mum was so furious that somebody was monitoring her sleep and judging her. She moved to the bedroom at the back where she couldn't see.
When no one could see.
When nobody could see, when the curtains and that were open. But it's an interesting illustration that, we are judged by our sleep. I mean, it's fascinating. And what was it, Benjamin Franklin? Early to bed, early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. I mean, there's many things I don't agree with that. But in my experience, the only difference between a morning person and an evening person is that morning people are just horribly smug. And there's a paper, actually, that's just come out showing that actually intermediate types and later types tend to be more creative. Aren't a huge swathe of us larks or owls? I mean, isn't there a huge proportion? Yeah, there's about 10% are proper larks, which is really early types.
Birds. Is that a sort of a 5 a.m.er?
Yeah. I mean, I guess you'd be wanting to get up around 6.
See, I get up at 6, but it's not because I want to get up.
Well, that's
I have 2 young children.
Yeah, well, that's also a dimension we need to unpack. 65 in the middle. 25 are later types. It's a long tail. There tend to be in society more late types than there are morning types. But one of the things we'd like to come back to with children, I think this is again an important point, is that one of the unintended consequences of increased wealth in the developed nations in particular is the move from an extended family to a nuclear family. Many people now live in couples. They have children, and the parents, and usually the mother, are the sole caregivers of the child. Now, in the past, And in my experience, I was looked after by my grandparents.
Took a village.
Yeah, and so, in previous generations, sisters, aunts, uncles, the extended family would all be there to sort of burden some of the childcare. We've lost that overnight. And what's frustrating is that young mothers in particular feel they're not coping because they're exhausted, they're tired.
Sleep deprived.
Because they're sleep deprived, because of the demands of particularly young children. And they feel that they're failing. Well, we've never evolved to be the sole carers of offspring. If you look at other primate societies, it's a devolved behaviour. And so what's so important is for couples who don't have the advantage of family nearby is to get a group of people that they can ring up and say, look, I've got to get 2 hours. Can you just pop over, sit in a chair and read while I'm taking a snooze? And not to feel guilty about that, and to appreciate that is perfectly normal. And I don't know why that message is also
comes
not going
back
out.
to being judged again.
It is, yeah. Absolutely. And, and I think if I might get a little philosophical for a moment, it's the old Protestant work ethic. Work is worthy. When you're sleeping, you're not working. Therefore, by definition, sleep is bad. It's evil.
I think that's absolutely it. I think people, and I think in any walk of life, we feel like we're wasting these hours of the day.
Yeah.
When we're awake, there are so many things we have to do. We always say there's not enough hours in the day.
Yes, absolutely.
And so we're extending that period of time as opposed to prioritising the other bit. If we prioritise the other bit, we'll get the rest of it right in a
Sleep
far
is always the
easy
first
fashion.
victim in an overcrowded day. Absolutely. And we don't realise that actually if we want to be, our best during the hours of consciousness, we've got to defend our sleep.
Yeah. So the single most important message to anybody watching or listening with regards to what they can do starting tonight to improve things, because we've talked a bit about sleep hygiene, and I know that you're not a massive fan of all the things that
I am. I think it depends on it works. Different sorts of things work for different sorts of people. No, I absolutely feel that what sleep hygiene is regularizing one's sleep.
Yeah.
Getting routine light exposure. You're sensible eating at the appropriate time.
You're very realistic about it. Like if you're reading a Kindle before bed, it's not the worst thing in the world. Yeah,
and that's one of the things I've got really quite incensed by, because if you go into the media, it's reading a Kindle, they call it an ebook, will destroy your circadian rhythmicity. And if you look at the data, even of the first paper, what people had to do was read a Kindle, an ebook, for 4 hours on its brightest light intensity before bed on 5 consecutive nights.
Right.
And that delayed sleep onset, and it was only just statistically significant by 9 minutes. And as one of my friends said...
And yet the headline is the headline.
Yeah, and so it gets confusing. I'll explain why it's confusing in a second. But as one of my friends at the time said, well, that may be statistically significant, but that's biologically meaningless. Now, it did have an effect upon melatonin. Now, this rhythm, the rhythm in melatonin from the pineal gland is often, again, inappropriately called a sleep hormone. It is not. It's a mild modulator of sleep. And it's true that melatonin pattern did change in response to that light exposure. But it wasn't translated into a big change in sleep. Yeah. Now, a few years later, a Scandinavian group essentially repeated those experiments, but instead of keeping people under dim light before the experiment, they gave them, I think it was 6.5 hours of moderately bright light. And that moderately bright light during the day abolished any effects in the evening. So it depends upon your light history. So if you're getting reasonable levels of light during the day, you're not going to be sensitive to dim light in the evening. So and in fact, it's really interesting. We don't fully understand the color, the wavelength of light, the duration, the time of exposure, your age, your light history, your angle of gaze are all need to be integrated. And we've got some advice out there which I think is inappropriate. So you shouldn't see more than 40 lux, which is really dim. for 2 hours before you go to bed. Now, that's based upon laboratory studies. It isn't real world. So again, highly controlled, great experiments, but it doesn't necessarily translate.
Yeah.
And of course, one's age, the sensitivity of the clock to light declines, and we don't fully understand why that should be. So there's lots of really important science that needs to be unpacked before we start giving guidelines which are well-intentioned, but could possibly be misleading.
Okay, so back to the final thought. We'll keep doing this, you and I, because this is where we go. But back to the final thought, which is, what is the message you would most like to get across to people that are watching or listening about sleep?
Embrace the sleep that you get. Be aware that the quality of your sleep defines the quality of your consciousness, but that we're all different. And so when you've found the pattern of sleep that works for you, defend it. Because, as we've touched on, we're all different. When, our chronotype, morningness versus eveningness, will influence when we want to go to sleep, the duration of sleep. So the healthy range is between 6 hours and 10 and a half hours. So it's a huge range, and it's working out what works for you and then defending it. And as I say, prioritizing. Sleep is always the first victim in an overcrowded day, but just be aware. There will be unintended consequences of not getting that good night of sleep.
Pre-warned. Thank you.
Pre-warned.
Brilliant, Russell.
Join us for the Performance People podcast every week for the highs, lows, lessons and stories from people like this lot. Michael Johnson.
Some days what I would see is a person who is a shell of what I used to be.
Eddie Hearn.
We don't operate in a business that's dangerous, but we just operate in one where you've got to sleep with one eye open.
Mo Farah.
It couldn't get any harder than what I've gone through, and at that point I just went for it.
Paula Radcliffe.
You can only control yourself.
Susie Wolf.
And Toto did once liken me to a donkey.
Every Tuesday, wherever you get your podcasts.